It is now my pleasure to introduce our first reader tonight, fiction writer Diana Xin. Born in China, Diana moved to Minnesota when she was 3 years old. Now, normally the mentors notify me of their selections sometime in mid-July, and I usually get to telephone the writers to let them know that they have been selected. But this year that was not possible with Diana, as she was spending much of the year living in Beijing, where she was teaching English and working on her fiction writing. Diana returned to Minnesota on August 29th, and on August 30th attended her first Mentor Series meetings and has been going pretty much nonstop since then. Her short story, Home, was published in the Alaska Quarterly Review and won Northwestern University's Tri-Quarterly Prize in Fiction. Diana enjoys yoga, traveling, and eating good food. And as our potlucks so far this year have demonstrated, Diana also enjoys preparing very good food. And we have many more potlucks to enjoy in the remaining months of the program. Please welcome Diana Xin.
Hi, thank you everyone for coming tonight. And thank you also to the Jerome Foundation for making the Mentor Series possible. And to Jared and the Loft for taking such good care of us. The story I will be reading from tonight is called The Magnificent Funerals of Grand Auntie Du. So I'll read a bit from the beginning and then skip ahead to the second of the two funerals that Grand Auntie Du receives. The Magnificent Funerals of Grand Auntie Du. Grand Auntie Du passed away in her sleep on a bright April morning when the paperboy was parking his bike over her tulips and the live-in nurse was humming to Cat Stevens downstairs. The last breath sighed past her chapped lips. A ladybug crawling along the wall opened its wings and lighted on the window screen. The blue curtains rustled in the breeze as death waited for the nurse to come discover it. On the day of the funeral a week later, Mr. Chang returned from his trip to Taiwan, grabbed some photos from his office, and drove to the Liu's house. Mrs. Liu was preparing at least 300 green tea, mochi, bean paste rice cakes for the reception that afternoon. Grand Auntie Du was one of the oldest members of the Oakdale Chinese Evangelical Church, and Mrs. Liu knew the attendance level would be unmatched. As one of Grand Auntie Du's closest caregivers, nearly considered her surrogate, Mrs. Liu had many duties for the funeral, but even so, she washed the flour off her hands and pared an apple for the lawyer. Mr. Chang spread his papers over the coffee table. "A ghost?" Mrs. Liu asked. "But what do you mean by a ghost?" "She was very adamant about it," Mr. Chang said, pushing his bifocals up the bridge of his nose. Mr. Chang had handled Grand Auntie Du's will since she was first diagnosed with stomach cancer 14 months ago. After 4 revisions and 5 calls in the night, he had quelled his habit for logic and obediently penned it all down. She was very satisfied, Grand Auntie Du had said, to tie up loose ends, and even a gold chamber pot couldn't save a king. Before Mr. Chang left for his golf game, she reminded him once more about the ghost, for he had been the most bothersome of all her possessions. "I believe it lived in her basement," Mr. Chang told Mrs. Liu. "She said it followed her all the way over from China." Mrs. Liu pursed her lips, for she thought she could detect a hint of ridicule in Mr. Chang's voice. "I don't remember she ever mentioned it before. Did she say who it was?" "That I would not know," Mr. Chang said dryly. "She also left you a collection of teacups and some porcelain. Those might be worth something. Would you like to see the list?" Mrs. Liu took the documents from him, her brows furrowing as she flipped through the pages. How did she ever have so many things? She left you mostly everything. I'm sure you can store it. You need to get everything out in a week, though. For the real estate people, yes, we'll take care of it. I just hope there's someone we can pass the ghost to. Mr. Chang chuckled and bit into a slice of apple. The congregation of the Oakdale Chinese Evangelical Church picked out the best clothes they had in black and dark blue, making somber expressions into the mirror as they dressed. Uncle Moy, the eldest member of the congregation since Grand Auntie Du's death, poked his granddaughter's hairpin into his earwax. Pastor Rickens flipped through his Bible and jumped up to run another comb through his hair. It was his first funeral service with this congregation. Auntie Emmy called Mrs. Liu to say she had found a monk. The ghost in Grand Auntie Du's basement wept miserably, for it had been a week since he had any company. Inside the casket that smelled of pine and formaldehyde, Grand Auntie Du blinked. On the seventh day, the Huin returned, and Grand Auntie Du rose from her body and her casket, the polished wood passing through her quite smoothly, if not a bit cold. She squeezed her way out the parlor through a keyhole and blinked in the sunlight. She did not remember it being so bright. The sidewalks glittered, and she followed them forward, crouching at the jarring screech of the cars. She found her way home despite there being no signs to welcome her and no talcum powder spread on the floor to catch her footprints. She flung open the doors to her basement, and Ghost looked up, an iridescent blue tear dangling off the edge of his nose. I have the most tiresome song in my head, Ghost, Grand Auntie Du declared. And look how dusty you've become. She swept the cobwebs off his shoulders as he rubbed strings of sticky tears from his eyes. You must look your best at my funeral, Ghost, Grand Auntie Du said. It shall be my only one. How considerate of them to hold it today. But Ghost did not wish to leave Grand Auntie Du's basement. You must come, Ghost, Grand Auntie Du frowned, or who shall I sit with? And if you do not leave the basement today, you will have to anyway once the new people move in, for they will not like you as I do. You are much too shy, and you never practice your English. She grabbed his hand and pulled him along. Skipping ahead. With Auntie Emmy's help, Mrs. Liu cleared off the coffee table to make room for the altar. They wiped clean a framed photograph of Grand Auntie Du and placed her in the middle. Then they planted sticks of red incense into an old flower pot and prepared a plate of fruit for the offering. Don't I look young, Ghost? Grand Auntie Du asked, admiring the old photo. I was 30 then. It was my first day in America. Or no, you're quite right. We were 21, and the photo was taken in a parlor in China before my wedding. The jade in my necklace was a gift from my dear Quinshan. You remember him. But poor Quinshan did not go to heaven either. We didn't know about heaven then. Richard will be there, of course, and I was married a long time to Richard. What a nice man he was. But oh, my poor dear Quinshan. In the last months of her life, she had wondered if, maybe, she would run into him again in her death. If maybe he would even be there to lead her through the transition. Now she was grateful she had not shared that silly hope with anyone else. She jumped at a loud screech from outside. The monk pulled into the driveway in his silver Lexus. Sorry I'm late. I had to borrow a robe, he said at the door. It's always better with the robe, though. I forgot to ask on the phone, but you don't got any cats, do you? I'm allergic. Mrs. Liu welcomed him inside and showed him to the bathroom where he could change. Is he allowed to have hair? She whispered to Auntie Emmy. I don't think it matters anymore. Hair, no hair, all the same. The woman at the bakery said he's excellent. He lived 5 years in a temple in Xi'an where they didn't even get tofu. I don't mind the hair, Mrs. Liu said, but there's just so much of it. The monk came out swathed in a maroon robe. A yellow cloth hung off his shoulder and ran diagonally across his torso until it tied at his waist. He smiled at the woman, displaying an uneven row of yellow teeth that once did not touch tofu for 5 years. The freckled skin around his eyes wrinkled. I'll just sit here, do my chanting, he said, pulling out a string of brown beads from the folds of his robe. Could I get a glass of water or something, if it's purified? You wanted 3 hours, right? You guys planning anything else? Music? Crying? Some people like it very traditional. I got some buddies who will cry for you on short notice. They really bring the emotion, these guys. One's got an acting degree, and he was on CSI last winter. I think a few prayers should do fine, Mrs. Liu said, glancing at Auntie Emmy for confirmation. Do most people still include the crying? Well, it all depends, the monk said. If they like the ceremony, they'll do it. But it's all for show, you know. Always was. Hard to fit it all in these days, though, even in China. No one has time for a proper death anymore. So, should we get started? Mrs. Liu lighted the incense, and the monk began his prayers, chanting as he rotated the beads around his hand, one by one. His voice grew low and sonorous. Mrs. Liu turned to Auntie Emmy, approval in her eyes. Swirls of incense filled the room and distorted the monk's words. His prayers rolled out like waves of the ocean and muted thunder. Grand Auntie Du yawned. Ghost gave her a mutinous look, but Grand Auntie Du refused to consider him. This is just in case I don't like heaven. We must always explore our options, Ghost, lest we get stuck in a muck of our own making. Oh, don't be a snob. Besides, it is nice to enjoy one's culture. Now pay attention to the monk, Ghost. You are being very rude. Grand Auntie Du looked down demurely as she received her benedictions. When she awoke, the monk was already at the door, wearing a blue polo and slacks. You know, he said to Mrs. Liu, you're supposed to have prayers every 7 days, actually. It makes things easier, for the dead, I mean. I can come back next week if you'd like, and I do the 7th for free. It helps make for a better reincarnation, you know. Protection against the dung beetle. I think this will have to be it for us, I'm afraid. It's really just a courtesy. Righto then, thought I'd check. That's what's wrong with Buddhists today, though. There's no more fear of the dung beetle. Here's my business card anyway. I'm at the dealership up Broadway. You sell cars? It's a hard livelihood for monks these days, he said. We all just have to adapt, isn't that the truth? Or unionize. Well, good luck with everything now. Sorry about your loss. Thank you for your prayers. Mrs. Liu held the door for him. I can tune a piano too, by the way, he said from the car. You gotta tune them in the spring, after all that wet season. Grand Auntie Du waved goodbye to the monk from the window before turning to Ghost, who had grown quite peevish. I suppose we can only wait now, Grand Auntie Du said. I think I should enjoy heaven, Ghost. But there is so much I can do if I were to live again. I could visit the museum in France or learn to ski. Perhaps I could have children my next life. I would have been a good mother, don't you agree? And maybe She fell quiet. When she was young, her best friend had the misfortune of falling in love with a poor man. Her parents refused to let them marry, and so they had exchanged a promise, one that was common around young lovers of that time, that no matter what happened, they would be together in the next life, even if they had to be horses or cows. But she and Kunshan had never been so naive. Ghost patted her shoulder with a transparent hand, and she smiled at him tenderly. They watched as Mrs. Liu came over, reaching through them to open the window. She waved at the incense to clear the air and offered Auntie Emmy a slice of pear from the altar. I should not like to catch cancer again, however, Grand Auntie Du said. Dying is ghastly, and it is preferable to do it only once. She reached out to feel her stomach where the cancer had lumped into tumors and clawed through her organs. Ghost, ghost, my stomach is missing. She wiggled her fingers in the gaping hole of her abdomen. The doctors had removed 3/4 of her stomach a year ago, but she had never had a hole. This is very peculiar indeed. The two of them retraced their steps, walking back towards the church to see where Grand Auntie Du had misplaced her stomach. The sun was setting and it washed the sky in red. Halfway there, Grand Auntie Du stubbed her foot against a fire hydrant and her pinky toe rolled into the street. They hurried onward to the church. Grand Auntie Du and Ghost rushed into the sanctuary, hoping to find help. The pews were empty, but Grand Auntie Du stepped forward anyway and peered around the altar for the door to heaven. As she seemed to be breaking, she thought it would be wise to leave rather than waiting for reincarnation. The Chinese were rarely punctual. She knelt before the cross, but no stream of light flooded down upon her. She held her breath, and her lungs shriveled until they were loose and waving in the air like empty sacks. Still she waited patiently and bade Ghost to keep watch. The red in the sky deepened to purple, and soon it was night. Thank you.